Have you ever been in a conversation, maybe just talking to someone, and suddenly this uh, really strong feeling hits you
Yeah.
out of nowhere?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like irritation, or sometimes it's this weird calm, or you just feel completely drained.
Yep.
And you think, okay, where did that come from? Is that me or
Yeah.
them?
It's a really fascinating question, isn't it? That subtle feeling like you're somehow influencing them or they're influencing you,
Hmm.
but you can't quite put your finger on how.
Yeah.
Well, in psychoanalysis, there's actually a term for this, countertransference. And what's really interesting is how the view of it has, well, it's completely evolved. It went from being seen as a major roadblock to, believe it or not, a really powerful tool.
A tool. That's quite a shift from being a problem. So, okay, let's really get into how that happened. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a particular paper. It's from 1979 by Hyman Spotnitz called Narcissistic Countertransference. And our goal here is to unpack how therapists actually learn to use their own emotional responses, these feelings we're talking about, to understand and help their patients, especially patients dealing with some really tough emotional stuff.
Exactly. We're going to explore how these, subtle, sometimes totally unconscious reactions can give crucial insights.
And we've got two case studies, too, right, that really show how this works in practice and maybe how tricky it can be sometimes.
Absolutely. They really bring it to life. So when this idea of countertransference first came up in psychoanalysis, the thinking was, well, pretty negative.
Like, just bad.
Yeah, basically. Get rid of it. There was this guy, Flies, writing in 1953, and he didn't mince words. He called it undesirable and a hindrance.
Wow, okay.
His take was essentially, ideally, therefore, countertransference should not occur. But it does always resistance, must always be analyzed.
Yeah.
It was just seen as something getting in the way.
So the message was pretty clear then. If you're the therapist and you feel anything other than, I don't know, perfect neutrality, it means your stuff is interfering and you need more analysis yourself.
That was the initial idea, yeah. But obviously that very rigid view started to change.
What caused that shift? What made people reconsider?
Well, you start seeing it in the writings. People talk about a tempering of the wholly negative attitude, that outright prescription, that total ban. It slowly shifts towards more thoughtful assessment and specific recommendations for the constructive use of countertransference.
So less bad, more, maybe useful.
Exactly. It was like a process of detoxification, as the paper puts it. Realizing it happens, yes, but maybe it's not just a problem. Maybe there's something valuable there.
Detoxification, I like that. It implies it wasn't pure poison after all. You also mentioned that the concepts of transference and countertransference themselves started to break down a bit. They weren't seen as just one single thing anymore.
Right, that happened alongside this shift. As psychoanalysis started being applied to a wider range of people, especially those with more severe issues, analysts noticed really different kinds of transference.
Like what?
Things like narcissistic transference or even psychotic transference. Very different flavors. And that led people like Kernberg, this is in 1975, to suggest there's a whole continuum of countertransference reactions.
A spectrum?
Yeah, exactly. Ranging from reactions you might get with, say, neurotic patients on one end, all the way to reactions induced by patients in psychotic states on the other. So it wasn't just one simple thing.
Got it. So much more nuanced. And this paper we're diving into, it looks at this through the lens of something called modern psychoanalysis. What's that approach about?
Right. Modern psychoanalysis. Spotnitz originally developed it back in '69, specifically for working with schizophrenic patients. It still holds on to the core Freudian ideas about transference and resistance.
Okay.
But it differs because it sanctions an extensive range of interventions. It doesn't just rely on interpreting things for the patient.
So what else does it involve?
It includes using symbolic, emotional, and ego-reinforcing communications, basically finding ways to actively support the patient's sense of self, their ego. While it started with patients who weren't responding to classic methods, it's now seen as useful in, well, all psychologically reversible conditions.
Sounds more flexible, maybe more hands-on from the therapist's side. So within this modern psychoanalysis, how do they define countertransference specifically?
The definition is the therapist's unconscious reactions to the patient's transference attitudes and behavior. But the really key thing here is the distinction they make within that. There are two main types.
Okay, and this feels important. Subjective versus objective, what's the difference?
Hugely important. So
Yeah.
first you have subjective countertransference. These are feelings that come from the therapist's own stuff. They're insufficiently analyzed adjustment patterns, as the paper calls it.
They're personal baggage, basically.
Exactly. rooted in their own past, their memories, maybe distortions. This is where most countertransference resistance comes from, the therapist getting stuck because of their own issues. And this is the type that still needs to be analyzed out.
Right. So that core idea of the therapist needing self-awareness is still absolutely central for that type.
Absolutely. But then there's objective countertransference.
Yeah.
And this is different. These are feelings that are realistically induced by the patient's transference feelings and attitudes.
Induced by the patient.
Yes, realistically induced. Now, these can also cause resistance if the therapist doesn't handle them well. But crucially, they're also seen as a major source of therapeutic leverage, a way to actually understand the patient.
How so?
The idea is that these induced feelings should be experienced freely and fully by the therapist. Really let yourself feel what the patient is making you feel. And then they should be communicated selectively back to the patient.
Carefully.
Yeah, carefully. When it can help resolve the patient's immediate resistance. And the impact, the leverage you get, is apparently proportional to how genuine that feeling is in the therapist.
Wow. Okay, so with objective countertransference, it's not about my issues as the therapist. It's about the patient genuinely making me feel something understandable, a real reaction. And that feeling can actually be used to help them. That does sound like a game changer.
It really is.
Okay.
And this paper zeroes in on one specific type, narcissistic countertransference. Spotnitz defines that as the analyst's realistic, effective reactions to a patient in a state of narcissistic transference, the objective type.
Got it. So the realistic feelings induced by a patient in that specific narcissistic state.
Exactly. And it's worth mentioning quickly that way back, like Ferenczi and Rank in 1925, they used the term too, but it was always negative pejorative. They meant the analyst's own narcissism getting in the way of the subjective kind. Spotnitz is talking about something else entirely here.
Okay, so we're focused on these specific induced feelings when a patient is in that narcissistic transference state. What does that actually, feel like for the therapist? What's this reciprocal interchange about?
Well, patients in this state often show attitudes that seem to symbolically bring back really early experiences, pre-Oedipal stuff before the age of 3 or so, very primitive feelings and ways of relating.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so the patient might seem totally wrapped up in themselves, almost like the therapist isn't even there. And the therapist might then find themselves feeling, well, totally unaware of the patient.
Really?
Yeah, or becoming self-absorbed themselves, maybe feeling drowsy, or just noticing their mind drifting off.
So the patient's internal state is kind of bleeding over, being mirrored in the therapist. That's wild.
It is pretty wild. Or, another example, the patient might unconsciously treat the therapist like they're just a part of themselves, not a separate person. And the therapist might then get this feeling of being in the presence of a kindred spirit or a strange sense of harmony. Meadow, another analyst, wrote about feeling objectlessness with certain patients. Like, the patient didn't have a solid sense of self versus other yet.
Right.
Or, here's a common one, a patient feels tired, but instead of saying, I'm tired, they say something like, you seem tired today, doctor.
And the therapist might actually feel tired then.
They might suddenly become aware of fatigue in themselves, yeah. It's almost like catching an emotion.
That sounds incredibly difficult for a therapist to manage. You have to sit with these feelings, which might be really intense, but not necessarily act on them.
It's very challenging. Spotnitz gives some stark examples from clinical work. He talks about working with a very depressed patient who kept talking about suicide.
Okay.
And suddenly, Spotnitz felt this strong anger bubble up, or these urges to get out of the office for the day or get rid of the case, feelings you wouldn't expect.
Wow. Or with schizophrenic patients.
Yeah, he mentions therapists feeling overwhelmed by helplessness and hopelessness, or even wanting to just tranquilize the patient, essentially reflecting the patient's own internal chaos or shutdown state.
Did he share any personal experiences with this?
He did, a really powerful one. He treated a psychotic woman who once told him, I talk to you 1 hour a week in this office and the rest of the week in my mind.
Wow.
He said for a year, while trying to understand her gibberish, as he put it, he felt totally withdrawn. At first, he thought it was his own issue, something wrong with him.
But it wasn't.
No. Through his own self-analysis, he realized the patient was inducing that state in me. Her withdrawal was creating his withdrawal.
So the big challenge here is that therapists, maybe unconsciously, try not to feel these things. They try to block them out or not be controlled by them.
Exactly. They use conscious and unconscious mechanisms not to experience these induced feelings. But here's the catch. Until you really understand the patient's problem, that very act of not feeling, of blocking it out, can become countertransference resistance. It actually blocks the therapy.
It gets in the way of progress.
Precisely. And these two cases we're going to look at really show how figuring out and resolving this hidden resistance, the kind that comes from objective narcissistic countertransference, is just absolutely vital for the treatment to work.
Okay, let's dive into the first story then. Mrs. C, tell us about her.
Right, Mrs. C. She was described as a bright and attractive woman in her late 30s, but she came in with some serious issues. Intense fears of falling apart, paranoid thoughts, depression, even suicidal thinking.
That sounds like a lot. And what about her background?
She talked about her husband being an overbearing bully and her mother being domineering. So you get a picture of someone maybe caught in controlling relationships, struggling with boundaries.
Okay. And how did this narcissistic transference show up in her sessions with the therapist?
Well, initially, she related to him almost as if he were the influencing part of her mind.
Like he was inside her head.
Sort of. Her ego boundaries wavered continually, meaning that line between me and you was really fuzzy for her. She actually said later, sometimes you were part of my ego, sometimes outside it. She often seemed convinced she knew exactly what he was thinking.
And how did that affect the therapist? What feelings did she induce in him?
When she would just ramble on without manifesting any interest in my presence, he found himself becoming self-absorbed, drowsy, or aware that my mind was wandering, just like we talked about earlier. And he admitted he resented the state of disinterest she seemed to be in.
So he felt shut out, ignored.
Yeah. And when he tried to ask factual questions, maybe to have her clarify things or ease her distress, she saw them as attempts to influence her.
So even help felt like control to her.
Exactly. Which then made him feel this pressure to maintain silence, like he couldn't say anything right. He felt completely shut out. Also, when she hinted that maybe he was secretly trying to get her back with someone, he felt these strong urges to prove to her how wrong she was.
So lots of feelings of being shut out, misinterpreted, and this urge to push back or correct her. The paper mentioned she was kind of communicating something like, "You're like my pre-Oedipal mother."
Right.
Yeah.
You either stuff me with food I don't want or you starve me. The core themes were all around manipulation, control, dependency, and a lot of underlying hostility.
Okay, so a really complex dynamic. How did the therapist get through this? What was the breakthrough?
It came through his silent analysis, basically, him carefully observing his own reactions, those induced feelings. He realized she was making him want to pressure her, to influence her, and her dreams were crucial confirmation.
Her dreams? How so?
She had these early dreams about being overpowered and then choked or raped, really intense imagery.
Definitely.
And these pointed towards an unconscious wish to be dominated. So it became crystal clear to the therapist that if he acted on those urges, she induced in him the urge to pressure her, guide her, or correct her. It would actually be playing right into her underlying pathology. It would be anti-therapeutic.
Okay, so recognizing that was key. What did he do then? What was a radical intervention?
He decided to essentially let her direct him, completely flip the script. When she accused him again of trying to influence her, he said something like, "I'm not playing that game. I won't impose my will on you in any way. I will talk to you only when you want me to and tell you only what you want to know."
Whoa, that's completely turning the tables, giving her total control over the interaction. They called it self-demand feeding.
Exactly, like letting an infant decide when and how much it wants to eat.
I can only imagine that kicked off what the paper calls a major battle.
Oh, absolutely. She complained if he talked, she complained if he didn't talk. It was intense. But he stuck with it. He consistently showed her that she could get him to talk when and how she wanted.
And what happened? Did it work?
It led to a huge shift. She started to see him as a separate person, not just an extension of herself or this controlling figure. The whole idea of controlling him actually started to feel unpleasant to her. And eventually, she began to express a desire for a mutually cooperative relationship.
That's incredible. A total transformation, really, driven by the therapist understanding and working with that induced feeling rather than just reacting to it or trying to suppress it. Okay, let's turn to the second case, Mr. M, the schizophrenic patient.
Right. Mr. M. He was 21 when he first came to treatment, after having a breakdown and dropping out of art school.
Okay.
He was an only child, parents divorced. His mother was described as cold and reclusive and had her own history of severe mental illness. She actually became overtly psychotic when he was 11. His father was often away.
So, a really difficult childhood background, and he himself was prone to psychotic episodes.
Yes, despite being bright and personable on the surface. I
Yeah.
think you had therapy before, right? Without lasting success.
Yeah, 2 previous therapists. What happened there?
Well, the first one apparently gave him many interpretations, which he apparently experienced as an attack. Didn't go well.
Ouch.
The second therapist, Mr. M, seemed to like him, but the pattern was that every time he seemed about to make significant progress, he'd fall apart again, have another psychotic break.
So when he started with Spotnitz, what was that like? What were the initial challenges?
Spotnitz felt really challenged to accomplish results, given the history. His first theory was maybe Mr. M had an inability to tolerate success, since the breakdowns always happened right when things seemed to be getting better.
That makes sense on the surface.
Yeah, but Mr. M was very hard to work with. He reported no dreams, he'd withhold important information, and he often just seemed to verbalize what he thought I wanted to hear.
Trying to please, maybe?
Perhaps. Mostly, he seemed generally immersed in feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, and significantly, he often had little awareness of my presence, much like Mrs. C in some ways.
Right, that's self-absorption again. And what about the feelings induced in Spotnitz this time?
Similar pattern. When Mr. M was withdrawn and self-absorbed, Spotnitz felt himself becoming withdrawn and disinterested. But he also felt these strong urges to shake him up and help him get going.
That understandable impulse to, motivate someone who seems so stuck.
Exactly, that very natural-seeming reaction. But here comes the crucial part, the big insight.
What was it?
Spotnitz realized that acting on those urges, trying to shake him up, encourage him, push him, that was the countertransference resistance that had repeatedly stalemated the case. Not just for him, but likely for the previous therapist, too.
How so? Why was encouragement bad?
Because for Mr. M, encouragement didn't feel like support. It felt like intolerable pressure to accomplish. And when he felt that pressure, he couldn't meet it. So he'd turn on himself, attack himself, and regress into psychosis.
Wow. So the help was actually hurting?
Precisely. The underlying unconscious message, hidden behind all the pleasing and withholding, was finally understood. I'm an infant. I don't want to do anything. He hated work, but he also hated himself for hating work.
So Spotnitz, and probably the others, had been kind of sucked into reinforcing that self-attack by trying to cheerlead him. What did Spotnitz do differently once he saw this?
He realized he'd been, as he put it, sucked into acting on the feelings he induced. So the strategy had to change completely. The new rule, absolutely no reinforcement for any self-attack.
Okay. And what did that look like in practice?
He told Mr. M he needed a long, long time to just recuperate. He actually said things like, forget about going to work. Just take it easy. Let your father support you. Live off the fat of the land. Baby yourself.
Seriously, just give up on working or achieving anything for now. That sounds radical.
Totally radical.
Yeah.
Goes against almost every instinct, right? Spotnitz himself admitted this position was rather frightening to take, and that he had a lot of resistance to taking it. It felt wrong, counterintuitive.
I bet. So what happened when he took that stance? Did Mr. M just, vegetate?
No, quite the opposite eventually. It's a completely unconventional approach led to the breakthrough. Mr. M shifted from attributing his lack of progress to his own inadequacies to blaming me for it.
Wait, blaming the therapist? How is that a breakthrough? That sounds like things got worse.
It sounds counterintuitive, I know. But in this context, it was a huge sign of forward movement. Why? Because it meant he was finally directing his aggression outwards, towards the object, the therapist, instead of turning it inwards and attacking himself.
Okay, so attacking the therapist was actually healthier than attacking himself, which led to the breakdowns.
Exactly. That internal self-attack was what was destroying his ego. Externalizing the aggression, even as blame, was a necessary step towards healing and building a stronger sense of self.
Okay, that makes more sense now. So pulling back from these really powerful cases, what are the big takeaways here about objective countertransference, especially this narcissistic kind? What should we, listening to this, understand?
Well, one key thing is that narcissistic transference involves this real indistinctness in ego boundaries in the patient, that fuzziness we talked about. And because of that, the effect it has on the analyst is also indistinct.
It makes it hard to sort out.
Exactly. The patient can genuinely confuse the analyst about whose feelings are whose. And the paper argues pretty strongly that figuring out and resolving this specific type of countertransference resistance is basically the key to the effective treatment of the pre-edible patient.
And comparing the two cases really drives that home, doesn't it? Mrs. C versus Mr. M.
It really does. Mrs. C, who was borderline, was actually relatively easy to work with in comparison. Why? Because the degree of separation between ego and object in her mind was clearer, even with the fuzziness. She could communicate more directly, and, crucially, her dreams gave the therapist clues, a barometer of her progress and the resistance.
But Mr. M, being schizophrenic, was a whole different challenge.
Much, much harder. His communication was sparse, no dreams reported, and his tendency was towards ego-sacrificing attitudes, giving up his own agency, being indirect. This meant the therapist missed the countertransference resistance repeatedly until it actually triggered 2 psychotic episodes.
That's a sobering thought.
It really highlights the danger. For Mr. M, even something seemingly positive from the therapist, like a brief expression of approval for some plan saying, "That's a great idea," wasn't experienced as support. It felt like intolerable pressure. It shows how easily a therapist can accidentally intervene in harmony with his expectations, feeding the illness instead of treating it.
Right. Intervening in a way that fits the patient's unhealthy pattern, even with the best intentions. And this connects to a really striking point Spotnitz makes about schizophrenia itself, doesn't it?
Yes, a very provocative point. He suggests that the general attitude that schizophrenia is incurable is almost invariably an expression of narcissistic countertransference resistance, meaning the patient feels, deep down, hopeless and incurable. They then induce that same feeling of hopelessness in the therapist. If the therapist buys into that feeling, accepts it as their own assessment, then yeah, the therapy probably won't succeed.
But if they recognize it.
If they recognize, wait, this feeling of hopelessness isn't just my clinical judgment, it's something the patient is making me feel, and they use those counter feelings constructively, Spotnitz argues it dramatically brightens the prognosis for the patient.
That's a really powerful idea. Hope as a function of understanding countertransference. So, okay, bringing this all back. Why should you, listening right now, care about these detailed clinical concepts? This isn't just for therapists, is it?
Not at all. I think what we can learn here applies much more broadly. It's about understanding those subtle, often completely unconscious ways we affect each other's feelings in everyday life.
In relationships, at work.
Exactly. Learning to notice our own induced feelings, those strong, maybe confusing reactions we have to people, can be an incredibly useful tool. It helps us understand what might be going on beneath the surface for the other person. It's about realizing that sometimes that intense feeling you suddenly have isn't just about you. It might be a signal, a reflection of the other person's inner state.
So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about your own life. How often might you, maybe without realizing it, be inducing certain feelings in the people around you? Or turn it around. When you feel a strong, unexpected emotion towards someone, could it be more than just your reaction? Could it actually be telling you something important about their experience, about what they're putting out unconsciously? What could you learn? What could you understand differently if you started paying closer attention to those really subtle back and forth emotional currents?